Okay, so now we get to Jason Stanley on propaganda. And I should say his writings about propaganda have been quite influential lately. He's a lot also in the public discussion about it, but they're very controversial. Arguably, he's observing a phenomenon that's important, but it's questionable that it deserves to be called propaganda. And anyway, I'll talk about it. Okay. Now, one thing that's a bit confusing with Stanley's writing here is that it's not always so obvious what his view is and what is opposed to and what he is not opposed to and why he's opposed to it. So he says about the previous definitions that on one hand, he's not opposed to these models, but he thinks that they don't help us to explain the attractions of propaganda, and they don't help us to explain the relation between propaganda and ideology. Okay. Now, my sense is also that Stanley thinks that his account, as opposed to these views, helps us to understand better the kind of propaganda that he thinks operates in our democracies. Okay, so that's my sense. So let's see what his ideas are. So he distinguishes two forms of propaganda. On the one hand, they're supporting propaganda. On the other hand, there's undermining propaganda. Supporting propaganda is more like the classical propaganda that we've mentioned. So supporting propaganda, according to Stanley, is a contribution to the public discourse that's presented as embodying certain ideals. Like here, the ideal of the leader who takes care of everyone, but uses non-rational or emotional means, and then uses non-rational emotional means to increase the realization of that ideal. Okay. So this is like the one, propaganda by speech, not directly related to a particular action, but a certain way of thinking. But it talks about realizing ideals instead. Okay, so to apply this to this case, here you have portrayal of the leader that takes care of everyone. So it presents an ideal in a way that gets people to feel positively about Stalin, because he's such a good grandfatherly figure, and that is intended to help the realization of that idea, where then Stalin becomes the only person who can take care of everyone, because he's getting all the power, like the patriarch in a classical patriarchal family. Undermining propaganda works in an opposite almost direction. Here, you present an ideal and use non-rational means to undermine those ideals. So that's a lot more difficult to understand. So we'll try to understand how can you present an ideal that's at the same time presented in a way that erodes, it kind of undermines that ideal. Okay, so we'll try to understand this by means of examples. Okay, and I think the examples that Stanley discusses are interesting and worth looking into. So the first example is the example that he talks about heart and the war on drugs and the law and order program by Ronald Reagan. Okay, so you need a little bit of background here. So law and order, still used today. So Ronald Reagan in the 1980s had been associated with law and order for a very long time. I mean, he became famous as an actor in the 50s, portraying, like in sort of Western movies, a sheriff who is responsible for law and order. That he was famous for portraying this kind of role. Then he became president of the United States in the 80s. And then he ran a whole program on law and order. Okay, that was his. He stood for law and order. And part of what needed to be fought was drugs which got people to be unruly and unorderly. So a big program in the United States of the 1980s is the war on drugs. Drugs were portrayed as really problematic, as really dangerous, as really undermining order, as threatening order. And were a lot of emotions were created. I mean, this was portrayed everywhere as like crack is taking down our cities, the inner cities are disappearing, people are just, there are lots of images of people living in horrible conditions, then appearing at sort of baseball or basketball events, just say no to drugs and so on and so forth, signing various documents and changing the laws. Okay. People were supporting this ideas because it was there's something horrible happening. Drugs are threatening order. Okay. Now, why though is that undermining? So the ideal is law and order. We want order, a lawful and ordered state. The irrational means is that one presents dark images of the dangers in a city, and there's an ideology here at play that those people living in the cities are blacks who are, and that's Stanley gives a quote here, they have been thought for since the early 20th century to be somewhat susceptible to drugs, that they go crazy when they take drugs. And the reason you needed that is that the laws that will result, in fact, sentence urban black cocaine use, that is crack, which is just a version of cocaine that's low quality. It sentences that 100 times stronger than white cocaine. So you have an ideal of our law and order. You present that ideal in a way which in the end erodes the ideal, because there's no order, there's no lawfulness to this at all. It's just creates a system where people can just track down anyone who's, for example, hanging out on the streets. There's no order or law to that really at all. It just makes everything less orderful. Okay, so that's a way to use propaganda in order to undermine an ideal. Second example. Free speech. So here the ideal is individual liberty. The individual who has, the states should not interfere with the individual. Individuals should be free to make their own decisions and stand up for their rights, have views that are different from the state's views. Okay? That's an important ideal. Now, you use the means to drum up this idea, you think, but that's an important idea. Somehow get that to be associated with companies as well. So now we have companies to be recognized as people who also should have liberty to make decisions for themselves and not be constrained by the state. But the result is an undermining of liberty, where people are now at the mercy of companies that have a lot of power over them, that are, as Elizabeth Anderson puts it in her book, that are a form of private government that control those individuals. So less individual freedom for the mass majority of real people is a result of a propagandistic use of that notion of liberty. Okay, that's the second example. Third example, and that's in the last chapter that I also sort of posted. Okay. And that's about we're thinking about democracy and expert knowledge. Okay. Now, as we saw when we started with Plato, Plato had the view that the experts should rule, and that the masses aren't really suitable for ruling. They are better off when the ship is run by those who really know about running a ship. Now, but who then are the experts? Okay. Now, Plato thought it was born into us, that some people are just born with a soul that's suited for ruling, while others are born with a soul that's suitable for fighting, or for a soul that's suitable for providing for the state. Okay, so deeply anti-democratic. Now, the decision between expert and non-experts is deep and important also for us. And we have this image, for example, of experts that we employ in expert committees and so on as, elderly white men like Jason Stanley or Jordan Peterson. While those who work on construction sites, so those who do knitting, those who play sports, they're not really experts on anything. So practical knowledge doesn't really count. It's theoretical knowledge that counts for expertise. Okay. So that's the first step in the puzzle. Now, the second thing that Stanley talks about is how John Dewey, the important educational philosopher, he's really the one philosopher who's most known for his work on the philosophy of education. So you find his famous saying that you associated with him on the internet: education is not preparation for life, education is life itself. So he wanted to make education more democratic. So this is in the early 20th century. Had lots of ideas that also have taken over in Norway, where it's not just as teacher who stands there and distributes knowledge to the students, but that the goal of education should be to make citizens good democratic citizens. So they should, for example, learn how to work in groups, should train them in the culture of democracy, should train them how to make decisions together in groups. It should train them to think for the common good. Okay. Now, what happened though is that this idea that education should be partly about training you to be a democratic citizen got then changed in an interesting way just by even his students. Okay. So there's a famous and very influential education treaty written to help as a sort of instruction manual for education that's deeply shaped the United States education. It's called the Cardinal Principles of Secondary Education. Stanley talks about it in quite a bit of detail, where they define democracy in an interesting way. Democracy's purpose, according to this document, is to organize society so that each member may develop his personality primarily through activities designed for the well-being of his fellow members and society as a whole. So democracy involves everyone, but it's like in Plato's system, where everyone has a particular role to play, and it's supposed to, education is a high level, the goal of education is a high level of efficiency in the individual for that system where everyone has a place. And individuals should be trained for those forms of social service where they can be most effective. So this has remnants of this, where everyone's trained to think for the common good, but now we're thinking about it in terms of everyone knows their place and just works like a cog in the wheel. And that, of course, decides now some people's places are to rule, but other people, they shouldn't really be trained to participate in these complex decisions, because that is not what they're good at. They're good women that support their husbands. They're good Black people who work in the construction sites. Okay? So he took the ideal of democracy, of being a good democratic citizen, and perverted that in a way which it amounted to the class system of Plato's Republic, with the guardians, the rulers, the soldiers, and the workers. Okay, so take the ideal of democratic participation and use that ideal to work against itself, to undermine the very idea of a democratic participatory system of government. I invite you to work through exactly how, in this case, read through that chapter, that last chapter, chapter 7, and know exactly how this can happen, that the ideal of democratic participation can be used against itself. With that, I end, and thank you for this listening to me in this module.